First, I have to thank the organizers of the conference, Colombia, here, Sebastian, Stella, everyone else who helped. Did a great job. Let's give them a round of applause. So this is my first time here in Colombia. It's actually my first time in South America, and it's my sixth continent, like achievement unlocked, which is great. So I was happy to get invited and be here. But I just wanted to kind of recap kind of my experience so far. I had a 26-hour total flight from Japan to get here, and so that was fun. Jet lag, hurricanes, all that stuff. It's been quite an experience. But I really learned a lot at this conference so far. I just want to share a couple of things. I learned that Rails can scale. I need some more excuses to write Rust. Clojure made a cameo, which is great. Circle CI uses Clojure a lot. I also learned that testing in Rails is back, and that if you don't write any tests, it's faster. GraphQL is also the bicycle of RPC. So today I have a couple things I want to cover. This is basically the agenda. I'm going to go over like what is Sinatra, give some context about what we're going to talk about. Go through like kind of the history of Sinatra, how I got involved, how the project was kind of formed, and some maybe future things about. And then I want to kind of apply those concepts that we cover and kind of build some level of rack, I guess, so that you can use it and kind of understand how Sinatra works and stuff under the hood, because I think it's going to help the people here and Rubyists in general. And I have some other stuff I don't know if I'll have time to get to. But so just curious, so I know like who's their first conference ever? Raise your hands, please. Okay, that's pretty good. Who's first RubyConf? About more, wow, yeah, okay. So who just learned Ruby this year? Wow. Ruby, awesome. Who has 5+ years of Ruby? 10? 15? 20? All right, I guess Matt's isn't here, so his hand is not up. Who works with Rails like on a day-to-day basis in their job? Okay, a lot of you. Yeah, this is kind of, I kind of get that feeling. Who actually used Sinatra before, knows what it is? Awesome. And who's like written a bare rack application, has used rack before, or written their own middleware or something like that? Okay. And who's written their own framework? Raphael. Okay, awesome. Well, I hope that like there's a good mixture of people in there, and I hope the talk kind of applies to each of you in some way or another. But it should be hopefully pretty interesting. I'm going to basically go through like the last 10 years of outdated documentation and blog posts that I found in making this talk. So it was fun for me and kind of nostalgic in some ways. So to give you basically an intro of Sinatra, these are some of the things we're going to cover, like what it is, what does it look like, just give you a rundown of kind of the features and the verbs and stuff that we use. And then some of the use cases and who's actually still using it today. And so if you look at the README and you want to know kind of like what it is if you haven't met Sinatra before, it says like Sinatra's a DSL for quickly creating web applications in Ruby with minimal effort, and then gives you this code sample. And if you don't really know what that is, it's kind of hard to kind of digest what that means. So I want to start with some vocabulary to kind of lay the groundwork here. And the first thing we're gonna define is what a library is, and basically that's just like a set of code that you'll reuse throughout your application and depend on inside of your programs. And a framework would be something where you have maybe multiple libraries, multiple moving parts and things. And lastly, a DSL would be something on top of the language that you're writing in to basically define another way to model the domain that you're working in, the problem space that you're working in. And secondly, HTTP plays a big part in this. And Phil, was it Phil? I'm terrible with names, I'm sorry. The first talk today about GraphQL covered a lot of this stuff. But basically, HTTP is just a protocol for communicating between a server and a client, whether that's a phone or your browser or just another terminal. It doesn't really specify. And And I recommend reading, or at least checking out these RFCs, these specs were when 1.0 and 1.1 were originally announced. There's a updated RFC that has all of like the modern information about HTTP 1.1. I recommend just giving those a look through. But basically, the spec covers 4 main things, which is message passing, the request and response cycle, as well as character encodings, authentication, those kinds of things, caching. But it also covers things you're probably familiar with if you built a web app before, such as status codes, request methods, like the verbs you actually define in your applications, and state, as well as HTTP is a stateless protocol. It does allow for some state in the form of cookies and stuff. And the idea is that your server maintains all the state. But the idea here is you use this technology and you can, in a number of ways, you can either build an API to define your program. Talked about REST earlier today and how that's basically a way to build conventions on top of HTTP. And RPC is basically the bear just making a call over the network to some other program. And so what does that actually mean? How does that apply to Sinatra? If I were to try to use this terminology and what we learned today at this conference to define Sinatra, I'd say that Sinatra is a bicycle. I don't know if you can't see that, it's terrible. It's so stupid. All right, but I would probably say that Sinatra is a library for building applications that communicate over HTTP, like really simply, using those vocabulary that we defined. In a way that HTTP doesn't define as standard of really how it should be used, and neither does Sinatra. It's really just raw HTTP library. You can build whatever you want inside of it. There's really no rules to build any kind of program you want. And that includes like services or web applications or whatever you want to call them. There's really no convention there into how you apply it. So it's up to you. And this can be really freeing, and I think that it's important to kind of understand. So Sinatra in a nutshell basically comes down to kind of 3 areas. And there's the application environment in which your programs are running. And that includes like settings, logging, that kind of stuff, any middleware extensions that you're using in your application, as well as the request part of the program, which handles inputs. And so you have a router, which you match URLs defined in your application. We saw earlier the get with the slash matches route, so the root, so any requests going in there all automatically go to that block of code and execute it. There's also filters and helpers and things for flow control. And then lastly, there's the response. After you handle the request, you want to put something back to the client. And that's it could be anything in views as far as JavaScript. It could be JSON. It could be ERB, which gets compiled to HTML. It could be literally anything you want. It could be plain text or binary. It doesn't matter. And there's also caching helpers in there, too, for doing that kind of thing. That's pretty much it. It's really super thin. Use cases that it's really good for, like I said, it's because it's so freeing, you can kind of build anything with it. Just build an application in a couple hours and just throw it away if you don't need it. All the way up to like fitting it in between existing apps and services. Or even just like what I think is kind of the main basis of this talk is kind of like learning Rails or learning underneath and being inspired to kind of explore more about these concepts. And there's a lot of people that are still using Sinatra today. GitHub still uses it. Stripe, basically their entire API is an abstraction on top of Sinatra. And Fastly is another big company. SoundCloud, all these companies are still using it today. And being a part of their major infrastructure, it's reassuring that Sinatra still kind of matters. Who has used Sinatra in the past? Ruby Gems, Bundler, and Sidekick all kind of originally used Sinatra in one way or another, some more than others, but now have officially moved on, which is kind of sad, but felt like that needed to be in this talk. But Sinatra has been largely successful. I mean, besides that, it has a ton of downloads on rubygems.org. I don't know if that actually matters or anything, but it's a large number, so that's cool. But I think the more obvious thing that a lot of people recognize it for is it's been basically copied into every other major language as a kind of just like a basic for how to build a web framework library, whatever you want to call it, in the language of your choice. And they draw their inspiration from Sinatra, but as we'll see in a moment, like Sinatra actually drew a lot of its ideas from other things. And that's what I'm going to talk about is kind of how Sinatra came to be. And it kind of started, yeah, like 2005, 2006-ish. The original creator, Blake Miserani, was working for like a now defunct startup in Silicon Valley. And he had a background, I guess, in Java and .NET. And so he, like coming from that background, had a bad time with all the XML configuration, all that stuff, and building applications. I don't know if you've done any work in that, but it's generally not very productive or like enjoyable to do. But they needed him to build a new service that needed to like maintain a lot or accept like a lot of requests and needed to be fast. And so he wanted to build something new and started hacking on it. At the time, Rails was really big, was getting more and more popular, and kind of simplified those ideas from ASP.NET Java world into something that was more enjoyable to do and more productive. But it was still like kind of too big for what he needed. And so at the time, he started developing this thing on Engine Yard, and he was talking to Ezra at the time about MERB. And MERB was basically like a tiny Rails implementation, more or less, but still drew like the MVC pattern and had file generation and those things. And he just didn't like how huge the directory structure. Didn't need MVC, didn't need a controller or model, just needed like a couple things, right? And at the time, another interesting project was camping, and that was originally developed by Why the Lucky Stiff. It was designed as kind of like a code golf experiment. Was turned into like 4 kilobytes of code. I really suggest you go read it. This link here, I'll post these slides later. But it's like the unabridged version with comments and everything, so you can understand it. Also, take a look at the original 4K part. It's like really interesting Ruby code. You probably won't even recognize it that it's Ruby. But it's beautiful. It was beautiful. It was inspiring, and he drew a lot of the ideas from Sinatra out of it. But the problem was that it was really slow. And obviously, at the time, there wasn't an unabridged version, so trying to understand it was complicated. And like I said, he only needed like 3 routes. He didn't need an entire controller, all that stuff. And the version he started hacking on it, he got it working, and he showed it to Chris, who's now the CEO of GitHub. At the time, I forget where he was working before that, but introduced him to Rack at the time. Was kind of a new concept. And it was developed back in 2007 as a way to kind of reduce code duplication from all these frameworks that were popping up in Ruby. Everyone just kept repeating themselves over and over again. And like we have this concept of dry in Ruby, right? And this was kind of the basis of Rack. Basically what it is, it just sits between your application and your server and routes your requests to your programs. It allowed Blake to focus on the UX development of like the Sinatra DSL and making it so nice to use and not have to worry about like HTTP header parsing or like any of that crap. So Rack was really sweet. And basically rewrote it using that, and one point was like, I guess he was having drinks with Chris or something in a bar, trying to decide the name, and they came up with like Diesel, like DSL, but there was Nitro. I guess that's a Python thing, so they didn't go with that. And then suddenly it just happened, and okay, we're gonna call it Sinatra. So that was it. And committed like the first commit on Git. I guess there was like the alpha version was originally in Subversion, but that was gone. He didn't have any clue where that went. There was this like weird repo.or.cz. I found that just like Googling around. That must have been like the original host. And then around 2008, it was eventually moved to GitHub. But the 0.1 release was made in 2007 on rubygems.org. And yeah, since then, it just kind of started to grow and grow in user adoption. And one of the first kind of early adopters was Ryan Tomeko, who eventually came on as the second maintainer and released version 09 and 1.0, which is a major release and major refactoring of Sinatra. And the way it kind of happened was Blake started working at Songbird, which was kind of like this streaming music service at the time, and Ryan had been contributing over IRC and stuff, and he's like, oh, you got to move out to SF, like, come work on Sinatra with me, and did it, and did all those refactorings and stuff. I'll show you a little bit about what he did. But then eventually it became like the 5th employee at GitHub, and like they worked together on this thing at Heroku for a couple years. And the whole time, like maintaining backwards compatibility and improving the library into what it is today. And the coolest thing that he did was, like you saw earlier, this is just kind of like what we call classic app style, where you just define your stuff at the top level. Like everything's kind of injected into objects and made available globally. But what he did was he allowed you to basically inherit Sinatra base as a subclass, and this allowed you to build Sinatra applications in a more modular way that you could extend, and you could grow them so that now you could build applications that were maybe much larger, and you could reinvent your own Rails if you really wanted to. They both have pros and cons. I think these kind of cover it, but yeah, it allowed Sinatra to fit in more places, and that was good. After that, basically, I mean, this was, around 2009, like, there was no Slack. Like, libraries usually didn't have, like, their own logo or, like, all this stuff you see today. Like, they weren't sponsored by Facebook. All the development happened online, like, in chat. And one of the guys that was constantly sending patches and stuff was this guy, SR. I don't really actually know the whole story about him. He seems interesting. But kind of, it's just kind of like a story of how back then this is how open source projects were kind of maintained, as just random people on the internet you thought were maybe a bot, just sending all these patches. And, oh, okay, you can have commit now, having never talked to them in real life. And then the third maintainer was Constantine, who did some work on Rubinius before that and did a great talk during his Sinatra maintainership years about Sinatra in 6 lines. Great talk. Go watch it if you have a chance, and definitely check out the source code. It's interesting stuff. But he had shipped like a bunch of major stable releases and just kind of helped carry the torch after those guys kind of moved on with their lives or whatever. And I see here like around 2011, that's kind of when I got started with the project and the recipes, called Sinatra's Recipes, and that was just basically like a cookbook documentation thing. I started on the project as like contributing doc patches. There's another like open source book thing that was available, and it's just, these were like literally my early days of open source contributing back then, and Sinatra was one of the first projects I submitted patches to. And so for me, it was always kind of like working on Sinatra and talking about it, it's kind of nostalgic because that was where I started, and those were my roots. And remember helping release Sinatra Contrib back in 2013 during a Y-Day celebration, which we used to have. We need to have more of, but just in general, I think. And like Jim was there, I got to meet Jim. That was awesome. Just a lot of good memories there for me in this library. And then basically Constantine kind of handed over the torch to me after that. And I released basically all these versions, and 2.0 final came out this year. But tried to do like a stable release about once a year, just to keep it kind of going and keep people, keep people going. I think a lot of people would use just Git for a long time, and there really wasn't a reason to make a release, but I had time, I guess. I don't know. So basically, those are all the people kind of involved in the project over the years. I think we have some interesting culture to share about that. Was keeping Sinatra kind of like the core stable and keeping it simple, and kind of using the community and plugins and Rax middleware to kind of keep things out of core that we didn't want to commit to. Each person spent about 2 to 3 years. I think I'm going on year 4 now. So if anyone of you wants to take over any time now, that'd be sweet. Here are my future plans for Sinatra. Anyone out there that does want commit-bit, wants to take over, you might want to start reading this post by Constantine back in 2014. Has a lot of great ideas. for what could maybe modernize Sinatra as a framework. I'm not really sure what a modern Sinatra would look like. I want to continue, obviously, to maintain the same culture that we had and focus on stability and keeping people running, basically, right? Keep the lights on for people. But there's some interesting things out there like H2, WebSockets. I know there's some discussions been happening in Rack and getting those kinds of technologies available in Ruby in the framework so that we could maybe do something in Sinatra. I don't know what that would look like or if anyone really needs it in Sinatra, but yeah, I mean, that stuff's out there. Like I said, I want to keep it kind of the same. I don't think Sinatra is really going to do anything too crazy. If you want to make the next version of Sinatra, you should just write a new one, and then we can start using that instead. At least that's how I feel. So if you do want to contribute, like there's other ways to contribute to the project. I think Sinatra is a great one, even though we're probably not going to go changing anything too great. There is a lot of low-hanging bugs and docs and stuff. All of the README is also translated and localized in a lot of languages, and I know there's Spanish and stuff. I don't translate that, so that's a good place to start if you're interested. But it's small communities like Sinatra and other things like Hanami where there's not a ton of people contributing, so you're not going to get stumbled on by tons of people reading your tickets and stuff. It's a little more welcoming, I feel, and it's good that we have these kinds of communities in Ruby. 2.1 is probably going to happen at some point. Depends on kind of what comes in. I mean, I don't write code for Sinatra necessarily. I merge what I think makes sense that people contribute and kind of help people contribute in a way that makes sense for Sinatra. And so it depends on what comes in. There's a bunch of stuff that I put off from 2.0, and that's kind of sitting in this milestone here. And there's other deprecations and cruft just from over the years of supporting Ruby 1.8, 1.9 that lasted for so long, and we finally dropped support for those versions. So those are good places to start. I think we could probably do some work there. But that's pretty much how it goes. So next kind of section, I want to dive into kind of how Sinatra works a little more, give you some more context about this stuff. And back in 2009, Blake gave a talk, one of the few Sinatra talks ever, which is interesting. But he said that Sinatra is basically the ultimate Rack citizen. And he also suggested that you build a bare metal Rack app. If you haven't, I think 2 people raised their hands. And in order to understand how Rails and Rack works, in order to be a better Rails developer or Ruby developer, just in general, being able to understand HTTP and how this stuff works, I think is important for your job as a web developer. The core concept of all of this is string concatenation as a service. Basically, it just all comes down to putting out strings over the wires, so it's not that hard. We're going to start with Rack and just kind of going through some of the spec and stuff, and it basically breaks down into 4 sections here. There's the application that you're running, like I said, similar to Sinatra. I mean, the Rack is really the innards of Sinatra. There's the environment, which is basically the request part as well, includes other information, response, and middleware. And we'll go through each of those and what they mean in Rack. And if we're looking at the spec, application is basically just any object that responds to call. That includes this class here that I wrote, also procs and lambdas. And you can see there it just returns an array, and we'll get into that in a sec. But it takes exactly one argument, and that's the environment, and then returns the response. The environment is basically just this giant hash with some useful things inside of it, and we'll get to use these in a moment. I'll show you when we write our own. But this is basically the request, and when things come in, params or whatever data comes in from the client, this is how you handle it. There's some other stuff in there for Rack, like the input stream, errors stream, the session store, and the logger. All this stuff exists in the end, so every time you get a request, you can output something in the log or whatever you need to do during the request cycle. And then the response was that array with 3 parts, and each thing has its own requirements to it, and the first thing you return is the status code, the headers. There's some required headers in there to be rack spec compliant, and then there's the body, which must yield a string and respond to each. Middleware stack, basically, any rack app has some default middleware that comes with it. Content length, chunked, all this stuff comes with it to basically make a rack app more usable, like user-friendly. And I meant to add some more context here about the middleware spec. There really isn't a lot. Basically, a middleware is the same thing as an app, like responds to call, but there's just some requirements around how it handles the response. If you write something out to the response, there's just some like weird things there that you need to be aware of that I did not document in this talk. A good example of is Logger. This is the thing you see in your console when you're running a rack web application. And it basically just wraps Ruby's standard library logger. You can see here it's like really simple. It's like 4 lines in the call method, and just makes a new instance of Logger and then adds it to the environment. It's really simple. And then continues down. You can see when it calls app.call, this is where it just like continue down the middleware stack if you want to use more middleware. Rack Builder is also a really cool part of Rack. This has nothing to do with the spec, but it's just like a nice way to basically create bare metal rack apps. And take a look at what that kind of looks like here. We still have the same class that has, responds to the call, accepts the environment, prints out the 3 things that we need. But you can see here, like we have a nice kind of DSL to build an application. We can use middleware, and then we can use this map thing and use an actual string to define the URL we want to respond with this hello app with. And basically, if you don't have this, I didn't actually add a slide for it. I should probably do that. But otherwise, you have to like look into the path info and parse the query yourself and determine which kind of thing you want to run based on that. If you're writing a pure rack app, it's not too nice. So this makes it a little nicer. But basically, yeah, like I said, add stuff to the middleware stack, run dispatches the app, and map constructs the URL map. Inside here, these are 2 methods you should be aware of if you're interested. Basically, URL map is poor man's router. Generates just like a route table is just a hash that's stored in the environment. And then when you dispatch to the application, you look up in the route table what the URL is inside of the environment, the path info. And we can make this much nicer if we use Musterman, like an actual router. And I'll show you that in a moment. But if we want to make our own rack to kind of understand these concepts and kind of apply what we've learned so far, I think this is probably the closest we can get to the metal. This is essentially, yeah, the API we're looking for, right? It looks very much like Rack, but just has a weird name because I didn't want to call it Rack, but yeah. So if we curl to our app, you can see, hey, like we respond to the content type in hello world, it works, right? The first part here we saw run, and so we're just going to implement that and just call server.new and pass it to the app. Server.new is really simple. It's just a socket application and writes out to the client on a request. This is Rack. This is everything you need to know. If you can understand this code and write it, I think you kind of have the concepts down. To make that nicer, we're going to implement a DSL, which is going to look a lot like this. It's very much like Sinatra. We have get blocks and posts, and we can use just a string with a path. It looks really nice. We have instead of like the array thing, we have a response object now that we're going to implement, and we can access the environment inside of the block, and we can access params too. You can see in the bottom there. In order to start our DSL, I just made a bunch of these methods in this module. This is basically straight out of Sinatra. A lot of the code here on out is simplified from Sinatra and Rack in order to make this actually functional instead of just writing fake code. I want it to actually work, so this is what I was doing last night instead of having dinner. Uh, but if we look here, like there's the route method, and this is defined basically, yeah, as a dumber version of how Sinatra works. It does stuff these routes in a hash, basically the same way that I explained it for the rack version. And then we use musterman here, .new. And just define a method, like a global method, given the signature of the request. And then when we start up our application server, instead of using socket and dealing with like HTTP parsing, header parsing and stuff myself, I'm just going to use WebBrick. This is exactly what Rack does. There's a WebBrick handler. WebBrick provides, Rack provides handlers for all kinds of web servers. WebBrick is one of them. Puma, Unicorn, all of those use other things. But yeah, this is essentially how Rack handler does it. Just mounts the application here in the HTTP server. And this is just a part of WebBrick. And when a request comes in, the WebBrick HTTP server will call this method, which we'll also define in our handler. And it takes a request and a response. So the first thing we're going to do is get the environment hash from WebBrick, and that's under this metavars thing here. And then we start our string IO for the response body, and we go through the middleware stack. Really simple. The next thing we want to do is actually dispatch to the route that we're looking for. So we're going to go through, using the request method as the key, we're going to go through all the routes in our table until we find one that matches, using musterman to match the route with the path info from the request. And then if we do get one, we're just going to assign the block that we added into the signature, and we'll do some params parsing. I don't know why I added this. I showed Eileen these slides, and she's like, you don't need that. But I was like, I can do it in one line of code. So whatever. All right, so we have a block. We have our params and stuff. All we really need to do is just call that block. So we've deferred it until we actually need it. This is kind of the cool thing about Sinatra, is it does defer if you build it this way. Or we'll raise a not found, which is essentially just another response with a 404 status code instead. So once we have that, we've called our block. We have basically the status headers and bodies from the response. We can go through and try to write. We can start writing to the response object. All that's here. This is basically verbatim out of Sinatra, I think, or Rack. Can't remember, one of the two. But really straightforward. Just writing to each, and then close it. Make sure we close it in case something else wants to write to it. We don't want to allow that. And then the middleware stack is actually really simple. It's just a static variable. I don't know how complicated it gets, but the response object, yeah, just a simple wrapper around that array to make it a little more nicer to read and understand. There's some things that are definitely missing from this. Like I said here, the content length. We could easily add that. I was just kind of out of time and patience, and I was like, oh, this is good enough. So sorry I'm not a great teacher, but I hope you got it. We can see it in action here. This actually starts up the WebBrick server. This is probably something that looks familiar to you if you've used Rails in development or something. And then if you curl one of those routes, you can see we get the get response, returns 200, and you're at foo, which was in the block there. And using my super sweet params parsing thing, you can see I use curl here to pass the hello as Colombia, and you can see the response here in a post. Yeah. So that's it. Just summarize that up. There's been a lot of frameworks in Ruby. I don't know how many. There's countless number of them. But I feel like Sinatra is the only one that really kind of wraps up the cool things about Rack and makes it accessible and easy to use, easy to hack on, and fun to use. But the important thing hopefully you got out of this talk was to learn your tools, understand this stuff, and just kind of poke at things, build it. Doesn't matter how good it is. Like that thing that I just showed you was probably the worst code, but hopefully it made sense. And you can kind of go from there and build your own things and have fun. I don't know, how do I have time? No time? Okay, let's check this out. So druby is a standard library for in the Ruby, and this tofu server is really cool. So the guy that wrote druby, Seki-san, made his own web server. It's really funny because he's like, I'm probably the only one that uses it. But if you look at it, it's really interesting code. He just wrote his own distributed web server by himself one day. And I don't think the Wi-Fi is working. But it's in the slides here. Should check it out. druby WebSocket is another thing kind of based on top of that, which implements WebSockets. So the person that made this basically wanted to use isomorphic Ruby with Opal, and they created like their own WebSocket server to be able to pass objects back and forth to the client. Thought it was really cool and interesting code. And I think you should go out and read it, check it out. That was pretty much it. Thank you.